I'm going to go over inspection of the airframe here, pre-cover inspection, and I'm pretty sure I've got everything all ready for a covering, fabric covering on the airframe. The covering goes to these Piper channels here, just in front of the front seat, and I've got nut plates in those all the way around underneath. This will be covered with the fabric here. This is as far as the fabric will go forward. And we've got the torque tube in. There's the lower elevator cable. You run through the pulley there and connect it into the stick and the push rod through the torque tube that goes through the torque tube. So that's in. And the cable is routed through that fair lead. Back here through that little idler pulley there, and that idler pulley has a cotter pin on it for a keeper, and we've got the cable coming out that, and then here's the upper elevator cable tied into the link there, and runs through the torque tube. So that's completed. There's the bolt that goes through that idler pulley there, and that's got a nylock nut on it. Bolt here that goes through for that cable attachment there, that's got a cotter pin on it. That's a castle nut with a cotter pin. This is the forward one, and it's got a, okay, it needs a castle, it needs a cotter pin on that one. That one doesn't have a cotter pin on it, but that okay, so we need a cotter pin on the forward elevator cable. Those cables go through that little shield underneath the front seat bar, the crossbar that goes underneath the front seat. They go through that. There's plenty of clearance there, side to side. They go on through, and this is the first pulley block here, and that's got a nut and a cotter pin on it, and the cables are routed correctly through the pulleys. The pulleys turn freely. Rudder cables go through this pulley here. This is the right one. This is the right side. The rudder cable goes through that pulley, and that's got a lock nut on that pulley, a bolt and a lock nut on that pulley. And the rudder cables come on down. And I added an extra fair lead on here. That's in. It has a clip on the fair lead. Here's the rear fair lead. Here's the jack screw is installed. It has a castle nut and a cotter pin on it, and that works good. Cables are all installed properly. Got the trim cable through there, that pulley. There it is. There's a fiber lock nut on that pulley. We got the link tied into the yoke, the proper bolts on that, lock nuts on that castle nut. There's the trim wire, indicator wire. We got a zert on the upper bushing for the jack screw, a zert here in the link tube, and a zert down there in the yoke. The bungee all set up there. Okay, I've got a cotter pin in that for a keeper on that cable. We'll get on the other side of that. I've got the saddle installed. Got the rudder cables tied off here. I'll move those up farther forward and coil them up where we can get to them through the fabric once it gets on. This is the lower elevator cable. It's got a Nicopress sleeve on it. Turnbuckle is locked with pin keepers. Got a cotter pin on the bolt there, a clevis bolt going in through that. This is what attaches to the bell crank on the elevator. Get the rear tube bushing, got zert in it. We got spring and a bungee cord on here. and I've got a pin, the correct bolt in there for that turnbuckle, and a cotter pin on it. That turnbuckle is loose. That will need to be tightened up in safety to tighten up the elevator cables to the proper tension. We've got the brackets for the strakes on and adjusted for the fabric, and I've got a new brackets down here that are on for the lower section of the strakes, the lower rear section of the strakes. So the strakes will come off there. They're just on there to till the glue gets set on those clamps so that they stay in position. Here's the ELT cable. ELT antenna is mounted. Cable runs through clamps, and there's plenty of clearance around everything. And these elevator cables got plenty of clearance on them. There's where the elevator cables come through that rear pulley assembly. They're not twisted over each other or anything. They run free. This cable right now is touching this diagonal here a little bit, but once it's onto the elevator bell crank and tightened up, it'll be free of it. There was no interference there. Here's the ELT antenna. Run down, and it enters into the half baggage compartment here, and then goes through another grommet into the upper baggage compartment, and then ties into the ELT right here. I don't have it connected yet. So, yeah, we've got the baggage compartment doors completed. Got a hinge riveted on down here. It's just screwed in right now with screws, so that can come out for fabric covering. And we've got Southco fasteners attaching it up here at the top. This baggage compartment door is the same thing. It's attached here with screws. They can come off real easily, and we've got it set up for the Hartwell fasteners there. This is the right side stringer. It's on here and tied down, safety wire, and it's fared in pretty darn good. Runs up here to the just behind the baggage compartment door and is tied in with safety wire there. You can see the pulleys there for the trim. There's a fair lead there for the trim indicator wire, and then another fair lead up there, and then there's the two trim cables, and they have castle nuts with safety wire on them. The fuel line, of course this is going to be inside, but this is where the fuel line comes through and out. All that's set up, and then we have fuel line going across for the vent line, crossover tube, and we have wires for the ELT here. This is for the GPS signal for the ELT, and then this other wire goes up here is for the annunciator panel, the remote panel, and those are all routed down into the back. Rear shoulder harness in, installed, got fiber lock nut on it, and that's about it for the right side. We'll go ahead and pull the airplane out and go down the left side. Okay, go down the left side of the fuselage, and again this is the Piper channel. This is where the forward portion of the fabric will go, is to here, and we've got nut plates in there all the way down on that for the panel. There's a panel goes in here to screw onto, so the fabric will come to here, glue onto that, and then panel go over the top of it. We've got the fuel selector valve in, and it's all buttoned up. Everything is right on it. The wires run down for the battery connection, and then these are the wires that run back for the tail aft position light and for the auxiliary fuel pump for the auxiliary fuel tank. Flap cable is in, and the flap pulley is in. Get a lock nut on that. Trim is all in. There's the new spring. The indicator wire is tied in. Here's the flap pulley and the idler pulley. fuel lines in and clear of everything down here. Flap cable goes up. I put a fair lead in here so that this doesn't bounce so much in here and drop down and rub on anything in here. Keeps it away from this auxiliary fuel line. This is the auxiliary fuel line, comes from the aux tank. Here's the trim cables, go through that phenolic block here, and then this is where the stringer on the left side hooks into the tubular stringer that comes back, is welded in the airframe. This is where it hooks on. It's all tied in and faired in real nice. Power line running down for the aux fuel pump underneath there. There's a fuel check valve for the aux fuel line. Left hand rudder cable, it goes through this pulley and routed through there, runs through the pulley just fine. Another phenolic block for the trim cables to run through, and continuing on back with the aft position lights and of course the stringer on the side. There's the pulley where the flap makes a transition up from the side of the fuselage and up to the inside of the airplane and up to the top. There's a added on fair lead for that rudder cable. There's the pulleys for the trim. They both have castle nuts and cotter pins in them. That's where the rudder cable goes through the rear fair lead before it exits the fuselage to go out to the rudder when it's mounted on. That's the right side of the airframe. Looking at it from the left side, you can see these pulleys for the trim system have castle nuts and cotter pins in them. Castle nut here for the yoke and the link tube. There's a cotter pin on it. We have lock washers on these. This is the pulley for the trim indicator line. There's lock washers, lock nuts on those. Cotter pin on this castellated nut for this bungee, both of them, all three of them. Rear stringer as it comes back and fares into the back, the tail. Vertical fin is mounted on there, good and solid. Runs down, and here's the bolt to hold into the rudder post. And of course this bolt here that holds this pulley bracket for the bungee holds the front of the vertical fin in. There's the lower stringer put on. It's tied in. This is where it fares up into the fuselage here. Fair lead we put on for the trim indicator wire. And factory fair lead. Again, the fuel lines over here come up. These are not going to be two are not going to be affected any by the fabric, because the fabric just comes up into here. And then this is a crossover tube. The fabric will go over this main tube here, and we've got a fairing built in up here with nut plates on it for the headliner for the baggage compartment to tie into, to screw into. And that's just riveted into that Piper stringer there. And then there are nut plates in here in this Piper stringer in the top of it for the skylight to screw into. There's the pulley for the flap. This is where the flap goes out to the wing. This is the front lower elevator pulley. This is where the cable makes the turn to go into the torque tube. So the pulley is mounted in there. It turns freely, and we have the cotter pin on it for control of that cable, keep it locked in. This Piper channel here is where the fabric is going to come up to. It goes around that. That channel has nut plates in it for the panel that goes over it, and we've got the wires here that go up through the battery for the battery and the solenoids, and they got good clamps on there. Clamp down. That cable goes on through there, it clears everything where it goes into that fair lead in front of that torque tube standoff. We've got nut zerts in all of these anchors for the floorboards and stuff. We've got nut zerts in all of those and screws in them through the floor plate. This nut zert here is for the ground wire that comes off the battery. These are aluminum backing plates, and that's what the cargo tie-down anchors tie into, so that gives it plenty of support underneath there through the wood, a lot of support. You can see in there that cable goes through that idler pulley just fine, and that has the cotter pin in it. There's where the lower bottom stringer ties into the piper channel that goes forward as part that's welded in, the metal steel one. We've got it anchored in 2 spots, a safety wire here, and then put in all these places with number 4 screws and lock nuts all the way down through every one of those tabs. There is the pulley cluster for the elevators. The elevators are routed through those. They're not twisted. No hang-ups on them. Got the castellated nut and a cotter pin on that. It's a fuel pump, auxiliary fuel pump for the auxiliary fuel tank. And here's the elevator cables. Nice and straight. Goes back into this rear pulley cluster, and there's a castellated nut, cotter pin on that. You see the pulleys there for the trim cable. There's the new bracket for the strakes. You get a little bend here, it's relieved here so the fabric doesn't ride on that raw edge right there. And there's this lower stringer, so we need to wash down these longerons real well before we can glue any fabric to them, but there's the lower stringer. Here's where got lots of wire coming out back here. This is the wire for the tail, for the aft position light and the beacon.